So for this video critical analysis essay, I've decided to delve deeper into Wang's chapter Against Innocence, Race, Gender, and the Politics of Safety, which was a 35-page reading from their book that I found a little bit difficult, to be honest, but it was one of the pieces that I thought was most interesting, especially because it was talking about the carceral state and the requirements for Black people to be innocent before we acknowledge them as a society or treat them as important. Because the reason why I'd gotten into student activism was because in 2020 I was fortunate enough to have one of my professors know how important it was to read literature written by Black voices about the Black experience. So we read Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, which is still one of my favorite books to this day, and I understood then how racism is not simply a symptom or just an outcome of our carceral system and our justice system. It is actively perpetuating it. I think that it's not something that it is afflicted with. It's not something that you can remove from the system. It's something that is integral to how our justice and carceral system function and how we think about justice, innocence, and punishment. So I think that's mostly what Wang is kind of arguing here, because not only does she talk about the politics of innocence, but she also talks about how it interlinks with race, obviously, sex, labor, gender. So these are all very important things that go into how the state determines who is worthy of public acknowledgement, public outcry, and who gets disposed of and kind of put into our carceral system. At the beginning of her chapter, Wang asks us to interrogate what we think innocence truly means, especially within the context of our carceral system. And she defines it on page 265 as being code for non-threatening to white civil society. And so she argues that this innocence becomes like a necessary precondition. She also argues that this moral purity and perfection become a prerequisite in order for Black people to become acknowledged and visible by the public, and especially by the state. Wang uses real-world examples. She draws parallels between cases of Black boys being murdered. So she calls on the case of Trayvon Martin, who was a 17-year-old Black American who was shot and killed by a policeman when he was in a park, as well as the murder of Isaiah Simmons, who is another 17-year-old Black American who was suffocated in a juvenile facility that he was staying in by the counselors. She mentions that Trayvon Martin, there was more of a public upheaval in response to his murder versus Isaiah Simmons, who I personally had not heard about him before, but I think that is also partly because of the lack of news coverage. The fact that Black death and violence against Black people is ubiquitous, that it becomes something that we are desensitized to. So I don't think my personal experience or lack thereof with Isaiah Simmons' case means that it was not politically or socially important. A big question she asks here is who is truly deserving of public attention and who is ignored. So what really is the difference between these boys and what happened to them? A lot of people make the argument that Trayvon Martin was just an innocent boy. He didn't do anything. And I'm not quite sure if anything would really warrant being shot. The case for Isaiah Simmons, a lot of people could say, oh, he was already in the juvenile detention center, maybe he had done something, maybe he deserved it. So I think this argument is made a lot, especially in circles where they're fighting against police brutality, but I also think that it comes within liberal circles where they're pitting against each other these figures almost, because they aren't really capturing the essence of the person. They're not typically fighting on behalf of the person. I think this is like thinly veiled racism where people are saying this Black body deserves more acknowledgement than this other one because this one is innocent and this one is not. And within this introductory section, Wang also argues that a larger consequence of choosing a morally pure figurehead to be the face of an anti-racist movement or political movement is that oppression becomes something that is done onto an individual rather than something that is a structural issue and something that has to be deconstructed collectively. The system also perpetuates itself by infusing into especially marginalized communities the importance of adhering to this white standard. Wang argues how marginalized identities are both constrained by the system and also how they may perpetuate the system. So they call on the example of during the war on drugs, they were punishing mostly Black Americans in poorer urban areas for very small drug offenses. And a lot of people in their communities would collaborate with the police and give them intel on people in their neighborhoods in order to be seen as morally pure. And while it would create a sense of security, there was no alternative for people who wanted to be safe for themselves and for their family, if not to work with the state and with the carceral system. Then it is truly much easier to disguise state motives to get rid of or imprison certain kinds of demographics because they are not innocent, rather than, oh, they are Black, or they are poor, or they are sex workers. So buying into the rhetoric of us being innocent versus them being guilty also strengthens the carceral state, even if it is within the same racial group or same ethnic group. And I connected this to Nanako Glenn's piece that we also read, From Servitude to Service Work, because Wang mentions how Black people in traditional family units are often destabilized as a result of the carceral targeting of Black men. So Black women are then forced to take on more reproductive labor in their households for their families, as well as take on more underpaid labor outside of the house. This next section is titled White Space, and it highlights how people who arouse feelings of fear, disgust, rage, guilt, or discomfort have to be made disposable to secure a sense of safety for whites on page 270. It underscores the consequences for Black and brown and marginalized communities when the state seeks to preserve white comfort over everything else. So it says on page 270 that the carceral system aims to criminalize perceived threats to white society. So by targeting specific communities, say people who live in urban spaces, people who are Black, people who are poor, people who are homeless, targeting those kinds of communities and putting them into prisons, putting them into juvenile detention centers, it takes them away from the public eye and it imposes onto them a kind of anonymity and invisibility. So an example that Wang writes about is how there was a figure of a Black male rapist who was especially keen on violence towards white women. And I think this also shows how some feminist rhetoric can enable the carceral state and violence against Black and brown bodies, because the protection of white women by the state is at the expense of Black communities. Also related to this white space and white safety was an interesting narrative that I noticed when I was growing up. People think about sexual assault, rape, domestic violence. People think about the shadowy figure that lurks in the corner, or somebody who's like in an alleyway waiting to lunge at you when you walk by. But if you really think about it, like statistically, people are made survivors by people who are in their lives, somebody who may be in the same house as them, somebody who goes to the same school as them, somebody that they've built a trusted connection with most often. Some, not all the time, but most of the time. So then people don't become weary of people who look like them, people who are in their neighborhoods. They become weary of who the state tells them is violent and who the state tells them is dangerous. But I did also want to go back to the title of this section, which is White Space. And obviously, white spaces are not accessible to all communities. It is kind of this utopia that is meant to be pure. It is supposed to be cleansed. And so places like Indigenous reservations or historically Black or Hispanic neighborhoods are kind of removed from the everyday white experience and white consciousness. So when a threat becomes public, like somebody is homeless where people walk to work or where people walk to school, and this encroaches on their like illusion of comfort because they do not come face to face with people who are in more adverse conditions than they are, or people who are targeted specifically by these social and structural inequalities, it is then that white communities tend to mobilize for change so that this discomfort is no longer in their sphere and they feel that they've done their share. And they may feel like they want to continue disposing of people who they perceive as threats, calling the police on people, maybe saying like they feel uncomfortable if they see them as threats to their white comfort. So for this third section called translation, Wang uses this word to show both the generalizability of the politics of innocence, as well as the translation of political uprisings into something that is both linguistically and morally palatable. So something like a riot is instead a rebellion. So instead of inciting images of broken glass or destroyed public property or anger, it's more about patriotism and fighting for what you believe in. So Wang also mentions that the politics of innocence places importance specifically on violence where anyone can be the victim of it. So if anyone can say, oh, that could have been me, that could have been my mom, that could have been my sister, or with the death of Trayvon Martin, people were saying that it represents the death of youth and the death of innocence, rather than acknowledging that it was a death that resulted from racialized violence in a police and carceral state. So Wang also calls on the idea of translation as public and social and political generalizability when she uses the example of some riots that happened in London in 2011. And a lot of the rioters were people of color. And so afterwards, when people were reprimanded by the police for rioting, for looting, for breaking things, people were saying like, oh, maybe they deserved it because I wouldn't have been unruly. I represent the common man, and the common man would never do such a thing. Especially considering the politics of innocence, when people refuse to or they can't place themselves in the shoes of people who are experiencing the violence, then how do you argue for the worth or the inherent value of people who are not completely innocent in the eyes of the state? I actually deeply apologize because I just started editing my video and I haven't yet touched on a social issue that talks about our carceral/penal state, as well as on the politics of innocence and white safety, which lives and which bodies the state deems as important and important to preserve versus who is more disposable. I think that even though the ICE raids maybe began with people who were Hispanic and of Latina descent, they've expanded to people who are Korean, who are working at a Hyundai plant. They've expanded to Black Americans who are living in Chicago. It brings up the same politics of innocence and how Black and brown bodies are associated with inherent guilt. Also, when people talk about immigrants and immigration, I've actually had this conversation with my dad because we are immigrants. My dad is thinking like, because there are people who immigrate illegally, then they are smuggling drugs or they won't contribute to American society. And I'm seeing these same ideas of people needing to be morally innocent and contributing to capitalism, like getting a good job, when it comes to narratives about who deserves to be taken in by the government. It's who is invading our public sphere. Even though we are not in the white space, I think especially as Asians, it's very unique, our position, because we are held in higher regard than other races because of our proximity to whiteness. I think it puts us in a different spot than other ethnic and racial groups who do immigrate. When people talk about immigration and who like deserves to be here versus who doesn't, it's usually people who the United States can make money off of. So people who are lawyers, doctors, scientists who have been educated in other countries, and we get to reap the benefits, even though we did not invest our public money in educating them. Maybe they deserve to be here. Hard-working families who pull themselves up by the bootstraps deserves to be here, but families who look different than us or who may bring drugs do not deserve to be here. But I think what it really comes down to, instead of like individual cases of immigration, I think it's a larger problem with how we deal with refugees, how we deal with immigrants. I think America definitely wants an ethnically white, pure state. I think we are descending into fascism if we were not already in it. A lot of the same narratives of like white safety having to be preserved, while we round up people who are not white, who make people uncomfortable because they are of lower classes, because they are immigrants, because they are illegal. I think it's that same violence that's being perpetuated. So this was a very long spiel. Thank you for listening to this.